So welcome to this latest No Silver Bullet webinar. Some of you I know, in fact most of you I know, it's lovely to see some familiar faces. The session is going to be an hour and I'm pretty good at holding the time boundary, so we'll finish bang on the hour at 5 o'clock UK time. In terms of today, let me just take you through the domestics briefly. Share my screen. Just a wee bit on how we're going to work together. Keep your video on and other apps and notifications off if you've got anything particularly noisy. Keep your mics on unless there's something particularly noisy like builders or screaming cats or dogs. We are going to have some conversations together. Be as honest as you can and want to be. There may be different opinions, so notice those differences and be as respectful and curious as you can be. On the technology, I've given up really kind of going through the Zoom technology because there's very few Zoom versions left after 18 months of lockdown. So I'm going to trust that you know what you're doing with Zoom, and if you don't, then please ask and I will do what I can to help. We are going to just do a wee bit of a kind of contextual check-in. If you wouldn't mind just diving over to menteecom and entering that code, I have a question for you there, which will just get us located in the territory of the conversation we're going to have. And the question is, what in your view is the primary function of a business school?
Steve, can you put the code up again?
Yep, it's on screen.
Yeah, thank you.
If I had hold music, I'd be playing it now. I have had somebody once on one of these sessions agree, who very kindly started singing. So if anybody feels like singing whilst we wait for things to come in, I'm not adverse to you breaking into song. And last week when we did this, we had a really lovely diverse set of responses.
Steve, did you say what is the function or what should be the function?
No, what is the primary function as it is now? And this is relevant because we are going to be tilling the soil today of, in a sense, the purpose of the business school and how that relates to leadership and organisations and how they wrestle with complex challenges. So it's interesting that several of these really bring to the fore the financial aspects of it and the commercial aspects of business schools. There are stories about business schools. These are that primarily, in some cases, we see them as commercial ventures first and educational establishments second, although most of them are connected to a university, or many of them are connected to universities. I'm also noticing, just for the benefit of those of you who may not know, on the session today we have several people who actually either are or have been employed by or worked in business schools and exec education context, so Mark and Richard, for example. So we have some interesting perspectives potentially here as we get into the conversation. So in terms of us and a wee bit of introductions, I'm Steve Hearson. I'm a consultant and a facilitator and an occasional coach. If you want to know more about me, please find me on LinkedIn. I'm not going to bore you with anything other than I'm in the process, a rather long process, of writing a book on the phenomena, as I see it, of the silver bullet and how leaders and organisations are perpetually looking for simple solutions to complex problems. And there's a functional collusion, in my view, between many players who consciously and unconsciously are looking to sell certain solutions or silver bullets to clients, whether that be business schools, large consultancies, small consultancies, independents like me, the fields of practice, gurus, thought leaders, people selling methodologies. There are many people who are involved in that functional collusion. And I'm delighted that I'm joined by Dr. Wendy Shepherd from Cranfield University. Wendy, would you like to say a few words?
Certainly, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, it's lovely to meet you all, and I look forward to an interesting discussion this afternoon. Yeah, my name's Wendy Shepherd, and I work at Cranfield School of Management in the Centre for Executive Development. And my role there is as Director of Individual and Organisational Impact. And I have to start really by saying that I'm passionate about the value of leadership and development and business schools. Now, that isn't necessarily because I work in one, and I'm sure you all think, well, you're bound to say that, aren't you, with the role that you've got? But actually, my passion stems from the fact that within my own career, nearly every opportunity I've had has stemmed from a period of study that sort of preceded it. And I really feel, very, very passionate about what study can do and what learning and development can do for individuals and their careers in terms of opening doors and creating new opportunities. I guess what frustrates me is that I think that business schools or schools of management, depending on how you want to term the sorts of people that we are, what they do very badly, I think, is explain the value that they create. And certainly when I went into executive development 15 years ago, I really did expect that as a school of management that talks about value propositions and teaches about value propositions, we'd absolutely have ours nailed. But that's not what I discovered. And unfortunately, whenever we went out to talk to clients who were looking to spend lots of money, I mean, these were people who were investing in big, big programs. And the question of organizational impact came up. What we had, I guess you could best describe as a tumbleweed moment, where people didn't really know what to say, and then they followed it by going, well, it's complicated. And of course, it is complicated when it comes to organizational level impact. But I didn't believe that was acceptable. I thought that, there is value. I know there's value because I've been on the other side of the fence. But how do we articulate that, and how can we improve what we do? And that sent me on a very, very long journey of investigating the value that business schools create. And I started a doctorate where I went in with the question of how does impact occur through executive development? And that's really where, my role now has developed. My research took me down sort of answering questions like, what do business schools actually do that's of value? How do we answer nervous purchasers who are looking for guarantees about the value that we create? And that's without colluding with them, because of course nobody can provide guarantees. That's not, what we do is far more complex than that. But also, I felt very much that if we couldn't actually really understand the value creating process, then how can we improve what we're doing? And that's really what my research has been about, is understanding more about what we do, how we do it, the value it creates and how that value is created, so that we can actually not just think about impact as a measure, but think about impact as an input in terms of what we're doing. What are the things that are going to drive impact through the interventions that we run? And that's really where my expertise today sits.
Lovely, thanks, Wendy. So the format for today is me and Wendy will shortly have a bit of a dialogue, which will be a follow-on in a sense to the first one we had last week. We'll cover some of the ground we did last week, but there's some stuff that came up in the first session that we're going to probably dive a bit deeper into. Then we'll give you a chance to have some small group conversations before we come back into the whole group for a bit of a plenary. In terms of our starting point, I guess where we'll start is with the kind of questions like this. Now, there's a question about what drives the need for certainty and how has that fueled the growth in management education. There's this question around whether or not business schools perpetuate the idea of silver bullets and guaranteed solutions when it comes to development and wrestling with complex problems. And the extent to which what's needed is a more grounded approach to supporting organisations and people. But in a sense where where I kind of want to begin is with one of the key tensions. This is a quote from Matthew Stewart's book, a really interesting book called The Management Myth, which is a few years old but still has lots of resonance now. And I'm not going to read verbatim the quote because you can all probably read it just as easily as I can say it. But the bit in there that I think resonates for me is that we've spent the last 100 years on this quest to look for scientific answers to unscientific questions and problems. And there's a kind of pretense of technological solutions to what are moral and political problems. He goes on to say that actually we have more to learn from several hundred years of philosophy and creativity than we do from the last 100 years of management education. And Wendy, one of the things that we talked about briefly before we came on, and I want to kind of tie that thread into something we discussed, was the response you had from your colleagues when you first rocked up at Cranfield, wanting to talk about your research and your views on impact, because that seemed to, from what I understood, jar a bit with some of the assumptions that were at play.
Yeah, I think so. When I started to really research the value of executive development specifically, one of the challenges I found, certainly when I went into the literature and looked about what people were saying about executive development, was that people weren't willing to talk about what goes wrong in executive development. People only wanted to talk about positive outcomes. And anybody who's been around long enough in executive development will know that, you know, there's no such thing as a program that is going to suit all people all of the time. And in fact, nothing works in all contexts. And that, I think, is something which is really missing when it comes to executive development and the conversations that we have about executive development, is that we don't get into discussing what works and what doesn't work within specific contexts. And as a problem that's generated by that is that we don't learn about context and things like that. So I was very keen to enter into discussions about what hasn't worked more than I was about what has worked, because it's only by understanding what hasn't worked that we can start to understand more about context and how important that is within a development setting. The other thing that my research took me down the path of is that not talking about impact based on the idea that it's a piece of knowledge that somebody takes away and then puts into practice, and that's where the value comes from executive development. And actually, my experience in the research that I've done has taken me down a route of thinking about other things that come out of executive development, which are equally as valid, if not more valuable, than individual pieces of knowledge. Now, if you're somebody like myself who's been involved in research and you've developed this piece of knowledge that you think is critically important and people are going to really value, and they come back saying that they got more out of the relationships that they developed and the conversations they had over lunch, that can be sort of fairly disappointing. But we have to take into account those conversations. We have to take into account the broader benefits of executive development and the impact of executive development, not just a single piece of knowledge, and to think about how that's being used to create value. So I guess that's where there has been some resistance to some of the research and some of the views that I have. But if we take something, you know, as simple as things like the relationships that are created through executive development, they're incredibly important. But very rarely, when I've been asked to design a program, have I had meaningful conversations, or had I had meaningful conversations with a client who said, we've thought about the relationships and networks that we need to be developing within this business. And therefore, these people are going to come on this program together to help strengthen their relationships and help them to learn more about each other and collaborate. It's more often that people will come to us and say, we're going to take this level of management and we're going to send them all at the same time. And then we can tick the box and say that they've gone through this development process. And yes, the people learn together and they learn from each other. But sometimes you're losing something in terms of the relationships that they're developing if they don't have the requirement to work together within that organization setting. So it's things like that. When we think about impact, we've got to think about much wider than just the topics, but also how they're going to be applied, who's going to be there, what the priorities are of the organisation and things like that.
So just picking up a thread from what you've said and something Richard's just put into the chat, which is his work in his OB module around the value of meaningful conversations between people in an organisation. Two thoughts I've got. Firstly, some of the language, executive development immediately, and management development and management education is predicated on the notion that it's only a certain cohort or certain tribes of people in organisations are worthy of development. That these are the most significant people, and it's only through developing them that will actually have an impact on the organisation. So I guess there's a question there, which is, to what extent is that a valid assumption? And to what extent is that predicated on a particular model of organising? And I guess it's maybe a related or slightly different question. Again, one of the things you and I have discussed offline from this chat now is the tension that's created when the student or client, because it's often clients, are expecting benefits and expecting guaranteed successes, and the collusion that goes on, which is we want this thing to work. And I experienced that when I used to work at Roffey Park. Can you guarantee the success of this intervention? So to what extent is there a kind of collusion around things that are, if I'm really kind of name it for what's going through my head, are simply not true? It is not true that you can guarantee an outcome. It is not true that it is only by developing people in the top tier of organisations that you can change the conversation or improve how people organise.
That's a long question, Steve, and I think there are three elements to that. So I've made a note. So if I can take them in turn, then the first question was about who to develop, and do we just develop, sort of the managers and leaders and the small percentage of people that sit at the apex of, a traditional hierarchical organisation? And the simple answer to that is no, we don't. We develop all sorts of different people for different reasons who come into Cranfield and choose to engage in development. One of the most inspiring programs that I was involved in was a program that was run by an organisation that was a professional services organisation, and they took a very broad view of talent. And interestingly, and I said, all of our people, our services are people. We're a professional services organisation. And actually what we don't want people to believe that the only career path for them is into management. If you're an excellent architect, then we don't want you to go into managing budgets. We want you to be doing what you're really good at, which is building bridges and designs and things like that. So the purpose of the programme was to help people develop their profession, not necessarily prepare them for management. And to some extent, to make people aware of what a management career would look like, so that they could think about whether or not that's really what they wanted and what was right for them, to stop them when they get to that fork in the road in terms of, do I become an expert in my field or do I become a manager? Which direction am I going to take? So I don't think it is just that we don't just look at development for people. We look at people to have development within their careers. Now, having said that, the more successful you become in an organisation, then often you start to, in order to sort of get further, you need to understand more about the organisation that you work in. So helping people understand more about the way organisations work and giving them a breadth of understanding beyond their professional discipline can be a good thing. So I think that's the first thing about who we develop. I think the second thing, I guess, brings on to a bugbear of mine is this concept of talent. And because my interest is in organisational impact, I always sort of question when people say we're going to have a talent programme and we're going to name it a talent programme and we're going to go out and we're going to select only a small percentage of people within our business to go on this programme. And we say, well, that's great. They've been called talent and they're going to be highly motivated and excited about the fact that they've been named as talent, so we can put a tick in the box there. Let's hope we've got some opportunities for them, because if they don't get opportunities within a period of time, once you've named them as talent, they're going to start being hungry for opportunities for promotion and probably going to go and look outside the organisation. And by the way, if we're thinking about organisational impact, how do all of those other people within the organisation feel who haven't been given a title of talent and what do they now think about their career and their futures within the organisation. So when we think about organisational impact, we've got to think far more systemically about what we do and where we go. And certainly some very simple mistakes that we can make is just the way we name programs and how we invite people onto programs in the first place. So I think they're really valid points that you make about who comes in for development, why, and what that means for other people within the business. The third point, I guess, Steve, that you raised was about collusion and the extent to which, as an organisation or as a business school, will collude with people who are asking for guarantees from the programs that we deliver. And I guess it comes back to, we need the Mentimeter. I was interested in what people were putting on there, and a number of people talked about the important role that business schools and certainly executive development plays as a revenue stream for the wider university. And, we've got to be mindful of that we are there to generate a revenue stream that funds research and other things that happen within the wider university. So there is this issue when you go out and you talk to a client and they're saying, can you guarantee this can work? Can you give me examples of where this has worked before? That it's a very difficult question. And, the temptation, I guess, can be to collude. What we've spent a lot of time doing is actually trying to work back from that question and say, well, okay, what are they really looking for at this point? And it's about value. It's about they're looking for some form of reassurance that their investment isn't going to be wasted. And the approach that we have at Cranfield now, and the approach that I've been sort of involved in developing, is this idea about designing for impact. And it's about getting early on understanding of what's valuable to the organisation, what's valuable to the individuals, and how do we create impact drivers within the design that will allow us to manage impact throughout the process, monitor what's happening as a programme is running, and make changes where we need to make sure that we maximise the value that people are looking to get out of the process, rather than just focusing on the idea of measurement. Because when we get into just thinking about measurement of value at the end of the programme, we've already lost the opportunity. We've wasted the time of the people who've come into the programme if they're not getting value out of it. So we work in a very, we put the client centrally to the process. Sounds like a sales opportunity here. Now, I'm not trying to get into this, but we put practice and what people are doing and what they're going to be using, what the purpose of their leadership is at the centre of what we teach. And we bring models and frameworks to that rather than the other way around. So we're very flexible in terms of our approach. My belief is that if you want to sort of really get, the maximum impact out of a programme, that's what you need to do. Because if you're starting to teach people models and frameworks that they can't understand within their context, it's not likely they're going to use it. In fact, they're probably going to forget it by the time it could be of use to them in the future.
We've got just a clarification question from Francoise, which is, could you clarify, Wendy, what you mean by value?
Yes. So value, I guess, is that for me, it's about delivering some form of positive change within the organisation. So when I think about value, I don't jump straight to financial return, because I think that the issue with jumping straight to a financial return is that businesses are complicated, and it's very, very unusual, unless you're dealing with a very small organisation, for the revenue of an organisation or its profits to be delivered just through the hands of one person or one leader within the organisation. It's complicated. So when I think about value, I think about the things that drive change within the organisation. So, for example, have we generated new conversations within the organisation? If you think about the role of a leader, talk is their business. That's what they do on a day-to-day basis in many cases. So what are the conversations? Have the conversations changed? And are those conversations more aligned with the opportunities that the organisation was looking to develop? I look at things like the networks. Have relationships developed? And are those relationships still of use to those people beyond the actual development intervention itself? I look at things like breadth of perspective. Are people able to solve challenges that they couldn't solve before? So that's where I'm looking at value, rather than in terms of pound notes or in hard measures like profitability or revenue.
So actually the measures, and this picks up something again Francois had as a follow-up question, the things you're measuring are some of the things that might historically have been described rather disparagingly as intangible. Whereas actually, what you're measuring is that the change in narrative, in story, in the conversations they're having, what people are actually talking about, what they're not talking about, rather than things that are easy to put in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, on an annual basis, I do an impact survey at Cranfield, and I look to understand, what percentage of people who've been through the different development opportunities that Cranfield offers have developed new conversations as a consequence of being at the programme, because that tells me that they've gone away and they're talking about something different. Now, in order to understand impact, we want to know, well, what was the nature of those conversations, which requires us to go back and interview people, which I do as well. But they're the sorts of metrics that we're looking at. Is first of all, are we generating new conversations? And secondly, what's the nature of those?
Lovely. So before I put people into some small groups, I have one final pithy question for you, which I think I know how you're going to answer, Wendy. Do you believe there is a silver bullet to the challenges, the complex challenges your clients are facing? And if so, what is it?
No, I think for me, I think that when people come to Cranfield and they ask, and it comes back to this issue of collusion, when people are asking for silver bullets and whatever, I guess what I've seen is that it's a bit like, people are in terms of, if you believe in ghosts and the door slams behind you, you may believe that that's evidence of a poltergeist activity. If you don't believe in ghosts and the door slams behind you, you may believe it's evidence of a draft. And I think that's the same with silver bullets. I don't think that any of the people that I know that teach within universities, and that's not just at Cranfield, that's across, would ever describe what they teach as silver bullets and expect that to be the answer to complex problems. Unfortunately, some people come to places like Cranfield wanting silver bullets and simple solutions to quite complex problems, because they're on the hook for delivering results day in, day out against targets in a predictable way. So they want a predictable solution. If they believe one exists, they may misinterpret what's been said as a silver bullet, but I don't believe that people who work within business schools and have done genuine research into problems would ever suggest that they can be solved by applying a very simple framework.
Lovely. So I'm going to suggest we pause there. I'm going to put people into small groups to chew on what we've been discussing. I guess the question is, what sense are you making of this, and what questions might there be that you want to bring back to us as a big group when you come back? So the groups are either 3 or 4 people. I'll open them now, and we will see you shortly. Lovely, welcome back. So I had the privilege of joining one of the groups, so that was really enjoyable. So let's just, for the last 10-15 minutes, let's just open this up into a more conversational space. It may be something you just want to put out there. It may be a question you want to ask Wendy. And first come, first serve, just noticing that we haven't got heaps of time. So be as concise as you can be in service of getting as much ground covered as we can.
Well, I have a question for Wendy, and it sort of, I didn't express this, but it came up in conversation, really good conversation with Anissa and Mike just now. So back to the idea of exec education and silver bullets. It strikes me that one of the sort of irreconcilable issues may well be that executive education, etc., is focused on an individual. It's focused on the skills, the perspectives, the capabilities, and therefore the expectations on an individual. And I think you said, Wendy, to have an impact and to go deliver some element of change in an organisation, that sort of thing. So, but I wonder, and what you spend your time doing, it seems to me in business schools, is to try to sell the idea to organisations, that actually the impact will be felt as a group, as an organisation across a number of people, and that things like relationships and connections become important. They might not be the main part of the sell or the main part of the impact ingredient, if you like, but they're equally valid. And I just wonder if there's an inherent tension there between organisations being groups of people working together and business education being focused on an individual, their skills, their perspectives, their outlook, and if there's any way out of that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, and I think we don't always focus just on the individual. I think one of the things and one of the developments that we've seen within executive development is often some form of organisational process, maybe the thing that sits at the centre, rather than the individual and their skills. And there's this concept these days of leadership as practice development, which is where you start with developing the practice with the expectation that the skills and behaviours will then follow. So you look at something that's going on within the organisation and you ask the group of people who are there for development to focus on that and to look at what the challenges are and how they can improve the process, and then get to what does it mean for me and what do I need to be doing in order to make that happen. And I guess the reason why that's more successful at an organisational level, if you're starting in that process, is that the individuals are not, they're not learning something and then got to try and transfer it into their context and see how it will work. They're actually thinking about their context and then deciding what needs to be brought to it. But I guess my point is nothing works in all contexts, and it frustrates the hell out of me when I hear people say, oh yeah, leadership as practice development, that's the answer. It should never be personal, never put the individual in the centre. So, well, actually, no, that's not true. Because if you've got a programme that's developing people for transition within their careers, and you get them tinkering around with practices and saying this is what needs to change, they're likely to really upset the people who've got ownership of those practices, because they're coming in with all the ideas of how it needs to change and why it needs to change, rather than focusing on what they need to do to prepare themselves to enter into a new community of leaders. So there's, it really is about understanding what it is we're trying to develop. And that's why I'm saying about understanding value and putting that at the front end. What does impact mean in this specific context? Is it about individuals and their development? Is it a specific strategy that we're trying to implement within the organisation that we need to develop the capability around? Is it about improving a certain practice that takes place there?
Thanks, Wendy. Other thoughts?
So I was framing the challenge in terms of Carl Weick's work on when you're teaching things in organisations, I think it's that book actually. Yeah, there we go. It's either that or social psychology of organisations, one of the two. But he talks about you can teach three things. You can teach things that are simple, accurate, and generalisable, but you can only pick two of those three. You can't do all three because it's full of cliche. And the challenge is that if it's simple and accurate, it's not generalisable. If it's accurate and generalisable, it's not simple, and that's what we need to teach. We need to teach the accurate and generalisable that's not simple, and that is complex theoretical work that can talk to practice and needs to be embedded into practice. But quite often what happens is, so even if someone's put the cognitive effort into learning it, they've then got to put the cognitive effort into embedding it in their organisation. And if they're only one of the special people and they don't have anyone else that they're working closely with, they don't have the social reinforcement to do it. So they end up just there going, this was all great, but I can't use it.
I guess, when I think is that we don't, it's not so much about teaching as learning, so I always like to think that within the context of development, what we introduce is new lenses for people to understand what's happening around them through different perspectives, to learn about it. And that's the way really of dealing with complexity, is to come at things from different angles in the hope that it will inspire sort of novel solutions to problems that they've not been able to resolve. I don't think you can teach a complex solution to people, because when you're dealing with complexity, there's a lot of tacit knowledge there that individuals develop just through having worked in and around that level of complexity. And language isn't complicated enough to translate that across to somebody else and for them to fully understand what you mean. So I think there's a certain amount of experiential learning that's needed to deal with complexity. And the best you can do within an executive development setting is either create simulations for people to start to understand that complexity, or alternatively to create opportunities for people to work on complexity, but within a safe environment where they can be supported and stimulated to come at challenges in a different way.
Any more thoughts?
What's coming to my mind is a question at a kind of broader level, which is, what problem for the organisation is executive education trying to solve? And you know, you've talked already, Wendy, about, is it a specific strategy that's being implemented, or kind of improving practice or management? And I really like the idea of moving away from individuals and talent towards something much more complex, systemic, relational. And yet what I'm sort of sitting with is the idea about what does it do to talk about these programs in this kind of way? So are organizations anxious about people leaving who they need to retain? Is it about retention of particular people? Are people worried about management and how to manage competition, say, between people, or to put in structures of career development? And that's very cynical. I don't think that's only what's going on, but I'm just suddenly really curious about that, because I think then what the offer is, how does it speak to what's really needed or being looked for from the organisation?
There's one of the things that I spent some time looking at as part of my doctorate is why do people actually invest in executive development in the first place? And one of the things that was apparent is that there are lots of reasons, and very rarely are the various stakeholders within the same company all expecting the same things, that people have all got a different view about what they're investing in and why. So in terms of trying to keep all of the stakeholders happy, it's very, very challenging. There are just, you know, there's a lot of good reasons, you know, to invest. But I guess, you know, coming back to the investing in individuals, if you think about, you know, a doctor or a nurse or somebody, they wouldn't just be sent onto a ward to practice and be told, you know, oh, go and work out how to do it, see what happens, you know, come back if you've got any questions, if something doesn't quite work out. And if you think about businesses today, they're incredibly complex. You know, the things that people are being asked to do, the responsibilities they have, and legally what they're on the hook for is so significant that it is the responsibility of organisations to make sure that when they put people into positions of responsibility, they have the capabilities and the understanding to be able to act in a way that is within the interests of the people that they're there to support and the different stakeholders they're there to serve. And and so there has to be, in my view, business education and management education. It's fundamentally important. And you know, I can't see in any other profession, and management is a profession these days. It's not just something that you do when you've run out of, you know, interest in the day job sort of thing.
And on that note, with a couple minutes to go, I'm going to suggest, unless anyone's got the world's shortest observational question, because it'll take us a minute to wrap up, but with the wonderful minds on this call, I suspect we probably have not got short questions. So I'm going to thank you all. It's been a really rich and interesting conversation from my point of view. It's given me food for thought. Thanks to Wendy. I'm sure she won't mind if you have any more questions to connect with her on LinkedIn. Some of the stuff that's beginning to come out of her research is going to appear sporadically on LinkedIn. I've already seen one post, so there'll be more on that. The recording minus Mike's lovely story is going to be cut out because it's confidential. The recording will be available as soon as I can sit down with my editor, and that will be available probably by early next week latest. And please do with that as you will. It's there for all of you to enjoy and go to sleep with, or whatever it is you choose to do with it. Until next time, it's been a pleasure having you all here, and see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Go well.
Thank you. Bye.